Well, welcome to today's event on the Armenian Genocide in Provincial Histories, Dispossession and Migration in the late Ottoman Empire. I am Joachim Savelsberg. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota, and I am a holder of the Arsham and Charlotte Ornessian Chair. Together with the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, we are sponsoring today's event. I want to just extend a very brief greeting at the beginning. We have a long tradition of annual Ornessian talks, very festive events that have been sadly disrupted by the pandemic. This year, I think we have a wonderful equivalent, almost equivalent, even though it is remote, with today's session. So I also want to greet you in the name of Alejandro Baer, who is, of course, the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I am very grateful to Berkan Kakla, who is a PhD student in anthropology and who played a central role in organizing today's event. I'm especially pleased to greet Umit and David Gutman, who are our speakers today, who wrote fantastic books that will leave a mark in scholarship on the Armenian genocide for many years to come. And so we are honored and very pleased to have you with us as teachers, yes, teachers too, as lecturers, but you will teach us. Finally, I'm very pleased to greet Luen Matosian. Luen Matosian is, we just determined, an honorary academic. She certainly is a historian with a profound level of knowledge about the Armenian genocide, about the links between Armenians and the United States, specifically Minnesota. And it is a great honor and pleasure, Luen, to introduce you and to pass the floor on to you in order for you to introduce our speakers of today. Thank you for being here, Luen, and thank you for doing this job for us.
Thank you, Joachim, for the very, very kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. At the invitation of the University of Minnesota Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and the Arsham and Charlotte Ornessian Chair, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's panel on Armenian Genocide and Provincial Histories, Dispossession and Migration in the late Ottoman Empire. And before we begin, I'd like to thank our capable organizer, Berkan Çağlar, a PhD student in anthropology. Also, Joe Eggers of CHGS will be facilitating the Zoom chat where you can pose questions for our panelists. I also wish to thank the Wexler Fund for Holocaust and Genocide Education for partial funding of today's presentation. So, over the next hour and a half, allow me to introduce our topic and distinguished panelists. I will ask a few questions to lead us off and then open up our discussion with your questions from the Zoom chat. So could you all please make sure to mute yourselves so that everyone can hear our speakers? Thank you. Okay, so when most of us think about the Armenian genocide, we associate those events with the year 1915 and its aftermath. Before 1915, scholars have also explored the Hamidian Massacres of the 1890s and the Adana Massacres of 1909 as examples of empire-wide hostile policies toward Armenians. In other words, scholars have shown us a pattern of persistent violence that culminated in the Armenian genocide. And to document the politics and the history of that violence is crucial and ongoing work. At the same time, scholars know far less about two other factors in the genocide. One is the wide variety of responses to mass violence. And two, the economic motive, that is, the prospect of material gain. Now, as for those of us with Ottoman Armenian family roots, we also have questions. If our ancestors left before the genocide, how did they manage to get out? And if they stayed in the country, how exactly did the genocide unfold in their local community? So to help us understand these issues, let me now introduce our distinguished panelists, Umit Kurt and David Gutman. Dr. Kurt received his PhD in history from Clark University in 2016. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, visiting assistant professor at California State University, Fresno, and currently serves as a Polanski Fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute while teaching at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Dr. Kurt's publications include The Spirit of the Laws, The Plunder of Wealth in the Armenian Genocide, co-authored with Taner Akçam, and his most recent book, The Armenians of Aintab, The Economics of Genocide in an Ottoman Province. So Umit, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Luyan. Thank you so much for this generous introduction.
All right, David Gutman, a graduate of the University of Minnesota, comes to us from the History Department of Manhattanville College. His 2019 book, The Politics of Armenian Migration to North America, Sojourners, Smugglers, and Dubious Citizens, I love that subtitle, examines the overseas migration of Ottoman Armenians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and the Ottoman state's response to this migration. And in addition to his current research on urban violence against non-dominant populations, Professor Gutman serves as managing editor of the Journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. So David, thank you also for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Luann. I'm very much looking forward to this.
Great. Okay, so I'd like to start with you, David, if you don't mind. And I'm going to ask some very basic questions here because I am not assuming that everyone here has had the opportunity to study your work. So let's start with this. Between 1885 and 1915, right? This is the period that you've laid out for us. Why did Armenians leave their homeland in the first place? Was it a fear of persecution and violence? Was it an economic motive? Just can you lay that out for us? Why did they leave?
Yeah, so the reasons for that are complicated, and so there isn't a simple, sort of simple response that it's either a response to persecution or economically motivated, but a mixture of both. My book is both the study of migration and the politics of migration. More specifically, what I mean by that are not so much what did people do when they arrived in their destination, but rather how did people leave the Ottoman Empire, through what channels, and how did they return when those who returned from sojourns in North America did return. This is in a context between 1885 and 1908. The Ottoman state officially barred Armenians from migrating to North America. So to make this journey was, for the most part, an unlawful one that required Armenians to migrate through these sophisticated smuggling channels that connected their home communities, especially in what I call the Harput or Harpert region of Central Eastern Anatolia. So most of those who are migrating, especially during this period between 1885 and 1908, 1908 being the date of the Young Turk Revolution, after which many of these prohibitions on migration were lifted, they're migrating through these smuggling channels. And to do so is quite dangerous and quite expensive. They have to go through these smuggling channels because it's technically unlawful for them to even travel from the Ottoman interior to coastal cities such as Mersin on the Mediterranean Sea or Samsun on the Black Sea. or later even as far as places like Latakia and Beirut, along the Eastern Mediterranean littoral. This is a difficult, dangerous journey. It's not legal even for them necessarily to be traveling again between their home communities and these port cities. And so they rely on these very, very well organized and complex, but also expensive smuggling channels. So migration, especially migration to North America, is both an outlaw journey, a dangerous journey, and an expensive one. So one big question is, who is it that is undertaking this journey? And there's a reason why, especially in these years, 1885 to 1908, so many of those undertaking these journeys are Harpertses, or people from the Harput region. Because as I argue in the book is also a local history of the Harput region, to try to make sense of why is it that it's people from these regions that are overrepresented among those who are leaving for North America in the pre-genocide period. And my argument is that the Harput region is in some ways different than other regions in the Ottoman East that have large Armenian populations. Let's say like Van or Mush further east, or like Eintop even, that of course Umit will be talking about. The Armenian community of the Harput region of Harpertes, relatively speaking, I want to emphasize relatively speaking, more economically and politically secure than their counterparts elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. And again, I want to emphasize that relative. That doesn't mean that Armenians in the Harput region aren't targets of violence. Of course, that's the case during the Hamidian Massacres. But there is a dynamic underway in the 1880s and in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, where there is some possibility for Armenians to buy land, to acquire some degree of economic success, and some degree also of political power in the region. And migration to North America becomes part of one of the sort of economic strategies that Armenians from the region are undertaking to be able to sort of improve their economic position. And certainly that's how it starts in the late 1880s and early 1890s, primarily as intended as temporary migration to North America in order to benefit from the relatively higher wages there, in order to remit money back, later perhaps return to the Harput region, and invest in land, perhaps open a shop, something like that. That is the primary impetus, especially early on, for people to migrate to North America. And even after the massacres of the mid-1890s, this continues to be a primary reason why people are trying to go abroad. And again, it's really important to keep in mind that because migration is a dangerous and expensive undertaking, especially given the fact that people have to go through these smuggling channels, those who are migrating are not destitute, are not people without land, aren't people without resources, because those are resources necessary to be able to undertake that journey to begin with. And even after the mid-1890s, the people who are migrating are primarily young men, either people who aren't married yet or people who have just married and often are leaving behind young families. So there's a huge risk involved in that too. The idea being that, when we arrive in the United States, maybe we will make enough money to be able to remit back home, to be able to eventually return, perhaps make us more secure living for our families, or to eventually reunite with families in the United States, reunite families, with migrants in the United States. So there's a lot of risk also involved in migration, and there's a sense that it isn't a flight from the immediate threat of destruction. Of course, people wouldn't leave their young families behind if there was a sense that immediate destruction was right around the corner. And so that's why I challenge a little bit the idea that pre-genocide migration is primarily driven by persecution or fear of persecution. Certainly after the mid-1890s, that becomes a much more visible impetus for why people are migrating abroad. But it isn't initially, and it isn't the only one even after the mid-1890s. And I think, one thing to keep in mind is that, wherever people are in the, Ottoman East in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, nobody's anticipating the Armenian Genocide. And so, looking back, and this was one of the things that struck me when I first began this research project, is of course, looking as a historian looking back, it's often hard to get past the fact that 1915 happens, and how can people not see that that's coming? But of course, this is how we all sort of interact with the past. Looking at it from the present, it can be hard to put aside the fact that our subjects that we're studying don't know what's going to happen. And so to sort of provide a more complicated picture of the Ottoman East in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, of Armenian communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is having a wide variety of experiences and a wide variety of responses to things like dispossession, to persecution and violence at the hands of the Ottoman state, but also in their efforts to secure their own political and economic futures in the communities that they see and call home, and that they certainly imagine having, regardless of the deep challenges that they're facing, see a long future in. See a long future in, a Armenian community surviving and thriving in the Harput region. And again, migration becomes, a response to that desire also.
Wow. A lot. So, all right. So you've mentioned, I see you've mentioned that at first migration was actually illegal, right? And then you've also mentioned the 1908 Young Turk Revolution. So can you just lay out very briefly what was the attitude of the central government towards Armenian migration in various periods here, right? Let's say up to 1908 and then after 1908, like how did the attitude of the government change in that time period?
Yeah, so between roughly the mid 1880s and 1908, like I mentioned, under the rule of Sultan Abdulhamid II, both Armenian migration to North America, but also return migration were outlawed. Okay.
But then afterwards, was there a liberalization? Was it possible did it become legal at some point to leave or to come back?
I think David is frozen.
Oh. All right. We can come back to David. I'm sorry that you're frozen. Let me turn to Umit here. And I might have to switch back to David. So Umit, bear with me, please.
I hope I won't get frozen either.
Okay, let's see
like a yogurt. All right.
Frozen Madzum, good. Okay, so Umit, would you just be willing to share with us the story of your visit to the Papyrus Cafe in Aintab and what you discovered there? Let's just start with that.
So David is back. So I can he's back, but I can start if you like. You're the boss.
Okay. Actually, David, if you're back, David.
I am here. My internet just switched off, so it's back on. I hope that doesn't happen again, but I have no idea.
All right, Umit, hold that thought. We're going to go back to David.
Yeah, my apologies. I don't know. There's all.
Yeah, no problem. No problem at all.
So I think where I left off was that the Ottoman state viewed the emergence of large-scale Armenian migration to North America as being the same. This is sort of the opposite side of the coin. With the emergence of Armenian political networks and the political parties like the Dashnak Sutsuyun and the Hinchakian Revolutionary Party in the late 1880s. Right. And so the concern was on the part of the Ottoman state that Armenians would migrate to North America, their minds would be corrupted, in what and this is literally in the documentary material, their minds would be poisoned in this sort of liberal, free environment of the U.S. Where there isn't any kind of, repression of political discourse, and then return to the Ottoman Empire potentially after having naturalized as American citizens, and then benefit from the capitulations, which gave American citizens as well as citizens of other countries extraordinary legal privileges when in the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
And so that was, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Because, that answers a question for me that I've always actually wondered about, right? If the Ottoman government saw Armenians as such a huge threat, why wouldn't they want them to leave, right? Mm-hmm. Why would they make leaving the problem? But leaving wasn't the problem, it was the return, if I understand you correctly.
Right, exactly. And
okay.
in fact, later on, the Ottoman state would open a legal channel for Armenians to migrate that would include the proviso that Armenians not be allowed to return, so that those who were given legal permission to leave for North America promised to never return and also to disclaim their Ottoman nationality. And again, that reflected the Ottoman state's primary concern about return migration.
Got it.
And so again, that position dominates until 1908. But with the reestablishment of the Constitution, with the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, one of the key conceptions of liberty that the Young Turks who come into power in 1908 are proclaiming is that of freedom of movement. That we have overthrown this dictatorship of Sultan Abdulhamid II. He is now just a figurehead. And so how are we defining this new regime? Well, part of this new regime is one that is protecting certain core liberties, one of which was freedom of movement. And so after 1908, the Young Turk government lifts these prohibitions both on Armenian migration to North America, but also return. And that transforms the dynamics. No longer do Armenians seeking to go to North America have to migrate through these underground channels. It becomes much more easy to leave. And that's why you see also larger numbers of people leaving from places outside of the Harput region, like Van, Sivas, Aintab. So you see much higher numbers of people begin leaving from elsewhere in the Ottoman East for North America, as well as also higher levels of return migration in those periods as well. That, of course, is brought to a very abrupt end in 1915 with the Ottoman involvement in World War I, and then, of course, the commencement of the Armenian Genocide.
Got it. Okay. So you've written about, I think you've alluded to this with smuggling networks, but this question is a little broader than that. But you've written about something called the migration economy, right? I love this phrase. So can you explain for all of us, what exactly do you mean by the migration economy, and how were local officials and business owners involved in that? What was their, as stakeholders, right? What was their stake in this migration economy? How did it work?
Yeah, so I think that we're familiar with this in the contemporary period. I think that many of us, when we're thinking about the question of undocumented immigration today in the 21st century, we have a broad awareness when we're watching, news coming out of the Mediterranean about people trying to flee in the hundreds across the Mediterranean in rubber dinghies, or trying to cross the Sonoran Desert from Mexico into the United States using these smuggling channels. We're aware in the contemporary period that when states try to make mobility, to outlaw mobility, that people find other ways to skirt those prohibitions. And in the same way, Armenian migrants in the late 19th, early 20th centuries are doing much the same thing. And you're seeing, just as you see today in the 21st century, very well-oiled, complicated, complex, sophisticated migration networks that link people across vast space and time, right? From Central and Northern Africa, across the Mediterranean, to Italy, to France, to Britain, that help people get where they want to go. That same thing, that same process is occurring in the 1880s through the early 20th century, helping Armenians to both leave the Ottoman Empire, but also helping them along the way through transit ports in Europe and then on to the United States. And these networks, despite the technology of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which of course is much less sophisticated than the technologies at the hands of migrant smugglers today, they're able to coordinate these networks across vast space. So you have a migration agent, somebody in the towns and villages of the Harput region, who assist would-be migrants in, planning their initial travel. They then have contacts with local muleteers, guides who are going to help them travel from the interior to the coast. Then when they arrive in coastal cities like Mersin and Samsun, they're introduced to a whole network of intermediaries in these places. People who, where they stay, like these boarding hotels where they stay often in miserable conditions, waiting for travel to be arranged. And then when they have their tickets for European steamships so that they could bypass port officials in these port cities, they're connected to boatmen then who row them out to waiting ships so that they can board ships under the cover of night so they aren't detected by Ottoman officials. But this process also works by coordinating this kind of thing with Ottoman officials willing to take bribes to look the other way, or to become more involved in assisting these underground migration networks. So these networks involve a whole range of different intermediaries, Armenians, non-Armenians, Muslims, non-Muslims, Ottoman officials, non-officials. So we're talking about these vast networks that bring together large numbers of people from otherwise very disparate backgrounds to help, of course, Armenians migrate, but also to profit from this. I mean, there's a profit motive involved in this, and a lot of money is generated and made through this smuggling economy, as is, again, something we're familiar with today in the 21st century. So I draw deliberate parallels between the dynamics that we're witnessing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and those we witness today, for example, in much the same geography. And we can see this again as responses to the efforts of states to crack down on mobility. When states try to prevent people from migrating, they find different ways to do that. And you know, I'll end with one arresting point that I make in the book, which is, you know, despite the technological disparities that exist between today and 120 or 130 years ago, migrating through these smuggling channels 120, 130 years ago is far less dangerous than is crossing the Mediterranean today in a rubber dinghy. And a big reason for that is because, you know, the more technologies at the disposal of the state, the more the state can crack down on unauthorized movement, the more dangerous the kinds of the channels that migrants turn to in order to bypass those efforts of the state to crack down on their mobility. So the Ottoman state did not have nearly the same tools at their disposal that modern states have to make the migration process that much more dangerous. And so it also sort of sheds light on how these kinds of tactics and practices have evolved over time.
Wow. Thank you for that. And you know, as you're explaining that, I have in my mind this map, right? In my own work on the history of Armenian migration, specifically to Minnesota, right where we are, over and over when I trace these immigrants that come here, right? They start out in you know, in the interior, right, Harper, something like that. They somehow make it to the coast. It's very difficult and dangerous. They get on a steamship, they'll go to, say, Egypt, right, or something like that. There's like a northern route and a southern route. They can go to Athens, they can go to Egypt, but they end up in Marseille, in France, right? Take the train, change trains in Paris, move up to the Havre in the north, and then get on another steamship and end up in New York, Boston, or whatever, and then take the train. I see that over and over and over. So you've really laid out exactly how that works. So,
and I think what's really important to emphasize is there are intermediaries along that entire chain.
Yes.
So this is a coordinated system rather than people sort of randomly moving. It's not random. It's coordinated.
Absolutely.
Again, despite the technologies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right. And then when they get here, right? When they get here and they find, say, a factory job in, I don't know, Worcester or somewhere, Worcester, Massachusetts, right? All of these people that have lent them money, or, you know, all of these exchanges that have happened, somehow this all has to get paid off, right? This is not a giant pyramid scheme. Somebody at some point has to make the money and start paying back before they can make enough money to, you know, to actually send something back to their families.
Yes, exactly. And I talk about that.
And so the migrants are taking a big gamble as to whether they're actually going to be able to fulfill their end of the bargain. And, you know, factory jobs in the United States did not pay well. So whether they were going to break even, come out ahead, or fall further behind, that was a big risk they were taking, even after they got here. Oh, that's so
Exactly.
interesting. Oh, all right. Wonderful. So at this point, I'd like to turn now to Umit, and I'll ask you again. I want to invite you to share that story of your visit to the Papyrus Cafe in Aintab, because I love that story, and I think it really opens up the whole question to us as to how you got started with all this. Just tell us what happened.
Thank you, Luann. It's so nice to see you again.
Likewise.
After all these years. And I would like to thank Berkant and Joachim and the Genocide and Holocaust Studies program in University of Minnesota for making this great event happen, along with my colleague and dear friend, David. So I believe as a historian and perhaps a narrator, as late historian Hayden White always emphasized, it seems that it's very difficult to separate your research problematic from your own personal history. At least there are so many instances like that for historians who are especially working on the dark annals of your own country's history, in my case. So it also makes you a part and sometimes active, sometimes passive agent of the same historical process. So you are sort of embedded to it socially, politically, and culturally. So it starts with your own uprising, continues in your education, and will be with you for your whole life. So my involvement in working on the history of Aintab Armenians, my hometown Armenians, is pretty much affected by that kind of intricate process, convoluted process for me. Yeah, the whole story, which refers to my entire ignorance, once I describe it as I was the dump in that story. So it was after my graduation from college in 2007. I was in Gaziantep, modern day, so Antep, modern day Gaziantep. So a friend of mine, I hadn't seen her for a while, so she wanted to meet, and then she wanted to meet me in Kayacik neighborhood in a coffee shop called Papyrus Cafe. So Kayacik used to be an Armenian neighborhood. Armenians, most of the Armenians overwhelmingly used to inhabit in this neighborhood. It was known as the Armenian quarter of the city. Of course, there were some Kurdish and Muslim, Arab Muslim, and the refugee families, especially from Crete and Caucasia, used to live in this neighborhood too, but Armenians constitute the majority of the inhabitants in this neighborhood. So I found Papyrus Cafe, which turned out to be located in one of those exotic houses. Like most of the houses on the street, it had been converted into a coffee shop as part of the process of restoring the city. You know, upon entering, a few letters carved at the top of the majestic gate. It caught my eye right away. Not recognizing the script, I simply assumed these were Ottoman characters. So inside, I was once more left speechless. There was spacious courtyard with staircases on either side leading up to two large rooms. It welcomed me. So the rooms were filled with antique furnishings and high ceilings were adorned with frescoes. And I felt this surge of pride in my hometown and ancestor. So I decided to talk to the owner to try to glean some information about the history of the house. Excuse me. He kind of verily explained that he inherited this place from his grandfather. It must have been especially strong coffee they were serving that day, as I was involved in the press further. And I asked him, how about your grandfather? From whom did he buy this place? He paused hesitantly before responding, and then after a few moments, he softly murmured to the ground beneath him, there were Armenians here. I said, what Armenians? What are you talking about? Were there Armenians in Gaziantep? He nodded. I was really, really getting infuriated with the opacity of his answers, you know. So, and then I retorted, so what happened to them? I was so agitated and he was so calm and so forth. Where did they go? And then I asked afterwards. He responded quite indifferently, they left.
Wow.
So this is exactly what Ömer Bartol, when he paid a visit, the renowned Holocaust historian, when he paid a visit his grandmother town in Ukraine, Buchach, which has been occupied by Russia now. So when he paid a visit and asked the same questions, Ukrainians exactly retorted the same, said they left.
They left, just like that, poof.
Yeah,
gone.
just like that.
Wow.
So as
Wow.
I rode the bus back home and I ponder why the Armenians, I mean, let alone Armenians, why anyone would just leave and hand over such an exquisite property to someone. So I was a naive and to the point of ignorant 22-year-old university graduate, unaware of the existence of Armenians in my hometown. So a few years later, I would find out the house belonged to Nazar Nazaretian, as you know, the honorary consulate to Iran, who was a member of the Aintab's wealthiest and the most prominent family. He was philanthropist as well and gave huge importance of the education and so forth. He, his children and his grandchildren used to live in this house. And those letters above the gate were not Ottoman, but Armenian. So spelling out his Nazaretian last name, I mean. So who built the house. So this is the story about how the idea to work on this topic and write a book out of it arose. I mean, so this is the book, the story of Aintab Armenians who were torn away from their homes, neighborhoods, and the city where they were born and raised. So it's actually a very, very traumatic story, not only for the Armenians, but also as an autochthon people of this place, but also the Muslims as well.
Yeah.
So this is the account of how their material and spatial wealth changed hands and was transformed, and as well as historical record of their persecution and the subsequent erasure.
Amazing. Amazing. I love that you started out asking questions, but you kept asking questions, right? I mean, you didn't get shut down. And a lot of people, I think, would not have had the courage to keep asking questions. So I think that's a very precious story. I mean that in the best possible sense, that you did that and that you shared it with us. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Of course.
So this is a local history, and most of the scholarship that we've seen on the genocide really has emphasized, national and to an extent international relations, right? But during the Armenian Genocide, you have central government policy, but how was that central government able to mobilize local people to participate against their neighbors, their friends, their business partners, whatever? How did they actually get them motivated to do that?
It's an excellent question because it happened the other way around, I would say.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
Yeah, that makes my work distinguishing, I mean, if I may say, from other invaluable works done by like Uğur Üngör, a dear colleague, and Hilmar Kaiser and other historians working on the local, localization of genocide, the execution of genocide at the local level, at the provincial level, what really happened on the ground, rather than focusing on the central policies and decision-making process and so on and so forth, which has been also a lot of work done by renowned historians like Dadrian, like Akçam, and so forth. In my case, in the case of Aintab, let's say, local actors, what I mean by local actors, they were ayans, eshraf, Aintab gentry. I'm talking about provincial notables. These local notables who were already rich and prosperous, actually. They were the ones who convinced central actors, first and foremost, the Minister of Interior, Talat Bey, and to have a decision, to take a decision about the deportation of Armenians from their hometown. And they did it just because of the fact that they were motivated by the promise of acquiring movable and immobile Armenian properties. So these elites meticulously carried out orders after having convinced the unionists, the CUP guys, sent by the unionists. So to ensure so-called the success of Armenian destruction, they an executive committee was established with the encouragement of the district governor, Ahmet Faik Bey, for instance, and the CUP deputy and well-known local elite Ali Janani. So its members included local notables, local CUP members, and civil and military officers. As a matter of fact, Aintab was not included in the deportation scheme of Talat Bey until late June 1915. Why? Because according to the district governor before Ahmet Faik Bey, I'm talking about Ahmet Şükrü Bey, and the military officer, military commander Hilmi Bey, they were giving guarantee to 4th Army Commander Cemal Pasha that this place was secure. Armenians and Muslims, they did not have any problem. There were kind of tensions, but they could be contained. So there is no reason to deport these people or to send these people away, you know, and sevkiyat in the euphemistic, you know, manner, let's say. Right. But these elites, first and foremost, these elites convinced Talat Bey to depose Ahmet Şükrü Bey, the former district governor, and Talat appointed one of his trusted men, Ahmet Faik, who proved Talat he was efficient, you know, and he was submissive and succumbed to his orders. He was appointed as a district governor. Once he set his foot in Aintab, he accelerated the deportation process, and he included Catholic and Protestant Armenians along with the Gregorians, Orthodox Armenians. So the local elites, in that sense, local elites, these notables were more enthusiastic, more fervent and zealot than the central actors.
Wow.
For instance, they started smear and slander campaigns in the city. They established Turkish club in the town, Türk Yurdu, Turkish Homeland Club, in order to instigate and provoke people in line with the ethnic Turkish nationalism by using religion, jihad, the jihad discourse quite a lot. So as you see, I'm not only arguing that economic motivations play a pivotal role, along with other also dynamics here. So these members, for instance, Debbagh Kimyazade, he was a local merchant. Provincial elite Kadir Bey, Nuri Bey, Seyyafzade Zeki, Hacı Halil, Seyyafzade Abdo Bey, all these guys, they prepared, they set the tone for the government to deport the population. So they came from a wide range of and different sections of society in so many different walks of life as an elite. For instance, I talk about this executive committee. This executive committee selected 4 representatives and sent them to Derzor to see the actual living conditions of Aintab Armenians, especially Protestant and Catholic Armenians, because most of the Catholic and Protestant Armenians were deported to Derzor. And as vis-a-vis Orthodox Armenians, who were mostly deported to Hama, Humus, and Salamiye. So these 4 representatives, they ended up in Derzor to see living conditions of Aintab Armenians firsthand, and ensure that circumstances render it impossible for them to return to Aintab.
Right.
Having done so, they could seize Armenian properties without any reservation. You see? So after confirming the dire situation of Aintab Armenians in Derzor, these committee members, Debbagh Kimyazade, Nuri Bey, Seyyafzade, Zeki, and Hacı Halil Bey, they freely participated in auctions organized by the liquidation commissions, Aintab Liquidation Commission.
So let me stop you there, because I hate to stop you anywhere, but this is bringing up another question that I wanted to ask you. And may I say, you really name names in this book, right? There's like a 20-page appendix, which is basically the business directory of Aintab and lots of other directories. It's an absolute bonanza for genealogists if there's family history people in this group. But anyway, we know that Armenians in Aintab owned businesses, schools, churches, homes, right? Inventory, all sorts of things. And you set the stage now, right? The Armenians have been, moved out through deportation, massacre, all of that. They've determined, the authorities or whoever have determined that the Armenians are not coming back. Can you describe the process for how all of that property changed hands? Was there a legal process? Was it extra legal? Exactly how did it work?
Wonderful question.
Hmm.
You're amazing. You know, you just
Well, I read it, you know.
you give us all the beef to elaborate on. So I would say there were two processes going hand in hand in the case of Aintab at the local level, let's say. The point is, there were rules, regulations, laws, and statutes which were known as abandoned properties laws, envali metrike kanunları. So these laws and regulations, they were so detailed, comprehensive, and so forth. And these laws and regulations were installed, so to speak, in order to protect and administer or maintain the properties of Armenians who were subject to deportation, who were subject to sevkiyat. So they stated in the laws that these laws and regulations would only apply to deported Armenians. And what did they? They first promulgated Abandoned Property Commission Law, June 10, 1915, law or regulation. And then in September 1915, when we were talking about the second phase of deportation, as Raymond Kevorkian pointed out, they changed the June 1915 regulation, and then they issued a law which stipulated to establish abandoned liquidation commissions in more than 35 provinces and districts in Asia Minor. The problem is we are deprived of the lack of the records of these property liquidation commissions. Their records were kept meticulously by the members of these commissions, state officers basically, and also the records of these liquidation commissions, including Aintab and Aleppo, were kept by general secretaries of the Union Progress Party government. So we are talking about various the same records at various hands, and these records have been kept in Ottoman archives, Prime Minister Ottoman archives in Istanbul, but they are inaccessible still to the researchers.
But they still exist.
They do still exist, but actually my work is kind of first of its kind, which comes up with a report, a transaction report of a Aintab liquidation commission regarding Sarkis Yakupyan movable and immovable property. So I managed to find from the family archives, from the Yakupyan family, thanks to late Pakrat Kazazyan, and because I obtained this report from one of his cousins, sheer coincidence, I would say. So it indicates how properties, movable properties especially, of Sarkis Yakupyan, who were deported to Hama, and then he died in Aleppo in 1919 out of typhus. So it indicates how liquidation commission auctioned his properties, including pillow of his child, yogurt cap, yogurt like bowl, including these items, is valuable items in the treasury of Ottoman Bank, for instance, and those kind of items, they were sold in auctions led by Tevfik Bey, who was the head of Aintab Liquidation Commission. Even Tevfik Bey joined the auctions, even though it was forbidden for head of the liquidation commissions to participate in auctions.
So we have a conflict of interest there, a little administrative conflict. Okay.
Yeah, I published this document and also develop on it in the book. So when you carefully look at the buyers, of course these items were sold at ridiculous prices. You know, I don't even want to talk about it. So it's so obviously. So when you look at the buyers, you would see those buyers were also active members of Aintab CUP branch, Aintab CUP club. So what we're talking about, political elites and who were local elites, local notables, their political and economic interests converge in this case.
Exactly.
In the case of Rhine, yeah.
Exactly. So, well, so speaking of the plunder of Armenian property, I'm really glad you took it in this direction, because one of my favorite quotes in your book is, you've written that, and I'm quoting you, huge numbers of people were bound together in a circle of profit.
Yes.
That was at the same time a circle of complicity. That's wonderful phrasing. So let me ask you, with that in mind, how did the Armenian Genocide prepare the way for the rise of a new upper class in Aintab during the 1920s and beyond? Can you speak to that?
So, of course, the expulsion of Armenians from Aintab, so it had been accompanied by the seizure of their assets and properties. And Armenians had owned not only houses, but also fields, inns, schools, shops, churches, most of which were appropriated by the municipal government for its own purposes. So not only individuals, but they were also like state institutions obtained, and stole these properties as well. So Aintab's CUP leadership was convinced that an Armenian communal life on Turkish soil was over forever. So the properties that Armenians were forced to abandon were expected to serve, however, yet another patriotic purpose. What was that? To strengthen an already national bourgeoisie in the city. So those in Aintab, now in possession of Armenian property, they were no longer vulnerable to challenge, because all Armenians left after 1921-22. They ended up in Aleppo and Beirut. So these elites used their political power during the Republican era in the fledgling Turkish Republic to consolidate their hold on these assets. So much of the physical and financial capital of Aintab and its elites was the product of Armenian genocide in that sense. Official Turkish historiography always claims that this Turkish-French war, Aintab war, for Armenians, Aintab İkna Başnuçun, Aintab's self-defense. So Antep Harbi, Antep Savunması in Turkish historiography, Aintab defense. So it was a heroic struggle for national independence, which earned the city glory and its grand title, Gazi, Conqueror. This Gaziantep's heroic epic was in fact a struggle whose incentive was to wipe out the Armenian presence from the city completely and for good. So its main motive was to ensure that the Armenians of Aintab will never be able to return. That was this obsession. So they shouldn't be returned, and they would never be able to return. This is what we have had to make them, put them in that kind of situation. So forcibly, or through various administrative measures, the outcome of all these struggles rendered it impossible for Armenian repatriates to remain in their native cities, towns, or villages. So, hoping to make these people flee their homelands again, the national warriors, who were exactly the same elites, by the way, continued to terrorize them. When the Armenians left Aintab for good in 1921-22, their houses, fields, estates, and properties were sold at bargain prices by Aintab Defterdarlık, another municipal institution. And more particularly, Armenian properties were offered at auctions organized at the initiative of local administrators. They were sold especially to members of the Aintab gentry, whose great-granddaughters and great-grandsons I went to school with, attend to school with. And these members of Aintab gentry, they participated in the Turkish-French war or supported the Kemalist national forces financially and logistically. Otherwise, the numerous properties once owned by the Armenians of Aintab were used to house the offices of the civil service of the central government. Yet in other cases, properties were handed out free of charge on the orders of central government and Mustafa Kemal. Upon orders from him, for instance, Armenian properties were distributed to Muslim notables, and they thereby formed the foundation of the city's bourgeoisie.
So this is something that that lays a groundwork then, right? Aintab in the 20s, Aintab in the 30s, Aintab in the 40s.
Yeah.
And then you've mentioned that you know, that you literally went to school with the grandchildren of these people. So that brings me to my last question to you, at least for now, that in Antep today, I'll refer to it as Antep in the present day, what has been the response to your work? Have any of these grandchildren read your work, and how do they respond to it? Have you talked to them?
It wasn't received well with welcome, warm welcome, let alone the warm welcome, no welcoming at all. What was interesting for me is the following. When I was doing my research, when I was writing, or publishing to a certain extent about the violent aspects or physical violent aspects of local roots of genocide, how genocide was unfolded, how collective violence inflicted upon Aintab Armenians, were executed and so forth. I had good terms with locals, and the common and ordinary people, even the current owner of Papyrus Cafe now,
Right.
They were okay with me, I got along with them. Also, I always found a way to get along with them and to stay at their good graces and stuff like that. You should be always discreet and alert. Anyway, but also I was like glean and getting information from them, by staying at their good graces and so forth. Right. They just, they already knew me. Okay, he's just, okay, he's in the blacklist anyway, he got enough harm and damage anyway, so he's another Aintab. He's a nice guy, he always smiles, he's not like making any political statements and so forth. Let him work, nothing is gonna happen to us anyway. But once this book was out, and once this book was about the material aspect of the whole thing, and then the whole, even the way they look at me, the way they stare at me,
I'm so sorry.
I've changed. I start receiving a couple of emails from the sons and daughters of the current owners. Basically, it's like they were like saying bad things and bad words and so forth, and insisting upon the fact that their ancestors bought this, purchased this property. I said, yes, you're right, you did. I'm not arguing that you stole this property. I'm only trying to explain the trajectory, the real order, how an urban, not let alone the property, as I'm talking about the living space for a population, for a community, how it was erased. It was a space where these people's daily practices, weddings, conversations, neighborly relationships, commerce, every single activity which make them feel like they were human beings, it was gone. The space itself was a living thing. It was erased. Yes. So that is I think the horrendous part of it for me. It's like you are making a living thing, like an entity, like a civilian death, like non-exist kind of entity. So so reactions have been negative, still negative. So when the book is out in Turkish, I think it will be more. There will be more.
Well,
but I'm ready for it. Yeah.
I can only applaud your courage and integrity and compassion as much as your scholarship. So thank you so much.
I appreciate it. But this is my work. This is my profession. I'm a historian by training. That was the subject matter I chose, I preferred, and I decided to work. Good. So I don't also want the whole my work being evaluated or considered as a work of a genocide. I'm talking about how a city was transformed economically, how the classes in Turkey, in early modern Turkish Republic, were also established at the expense of what, of course, for sure.
Right.
And I'm talking about transforming an urban space and how urban violence also came into existence and so forth.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Umit,
Pleasure.
and
Pleasure.
on many levels. All right, so before we open up the discussion to questions from the Zoom chat, is there anything, either David or Umit, that you would like to add that you have been burning to say and didn't get a chance to say? Or should we go straight to the Zoom chat? It's up to you.
I'm happy to go to the chat. Absolutely.
Yeah,
All right.
so am I.
Okay, great. All right, so Joe Eggers, I'm going to depend on you here.
Sure, we have a first question here from the Q&A asking, my parents came from Armenia in 1917 through Yokohama, Japan. Can you talk about the migration to Japan or to Russia, then Japan looked like?
Unfortunately, since most of my work dealt with pre-genocide migration, I didn't come across evidence of people going through Russia into Japan. The closest that I came to were especially people from K in the Erzurum area who were migrating through Batumi, which was under Russian control. But as far as going as far afield as Japan, yeah, I didn't come across any evidence that was a large-scale movement, at least in the pre-genocide period. But in World War I think it's there's reasons why people would be searching alternative routes. Obviously, World War I shut down or deeply impacted Mediterranean and Atlantic travel, made it much more difficult, of course, to leave the Ottoman Empire to begin with, and then to travel across the Atlantic. So that the disruption of World War I is what likely forced your ancestor then to have to go through Russia and Japan. But since I'm dealing with the pre-genocide era, I didn't see evidence of that being a common route during that period.
Yeah, another question here for David, and actually, Luann, you might have an answer for this as well. When Armenians migrated to North America, is there any indication as to how long they intended to stay, or would they need to stay before returning? I ask because my great grandfather immigrated to the U.S. in 1911, leaving a young family behind in Sivas, whom he didn't see again until 1920, after they had survived the genocide. I wonder what his intentions were, to bring them to North America or to go back to Sivas. But 1911 to 1915 is also a very long time to be away from one's family. Are there any indications of how long people migrating stayed in the U.S. before returning to their family or bringing them over to North America?
Yeah, so something like that you're discussing is very common. And so, of course, I can't, it's hard in that specific case to determine, well, was it his initial intent to leave and come back, or to leave and then bring to bring his family, to reunite with his family in the United States. I think the later you go, the more common that latter result is. So it becomes more common that people are leaving and imagining reuniting with their family in the United States early on. So people who are leaving in the late 1880s, early 1890s, much more common that they're looking to return at some point. But the person who's on the cover of my book, so if you see the cover of my book, is a person named, oh, there you go, exactly. So that's the person laying down there with the axe next to his head is Ohannes Topalian, and he is from Gurun, so actually closer to Sivas than to Harput or Harpert. And he left in 1891, left his family in 1891. He wasn't married at the time. He naturalized as an American citizen in 1897 after 5 years of residence in the U.S. per U.S. law. He joined the U.S. Army and fought in the Spanish-American War. And then after receiving a letter from his father, he returned to Gurun in 1901 to marry and have a child. So he married and had a child in Gurun. Tried to secure passports because he was an American citizen, tried to secure passports for his family from the American consul in Sivas, who rejected his request for a passport for he and his family so they could return to the United States. Because he had entered the Ottoman Empire masquerading as an Ottoman subject, which he had to do. If he had presented himself as an American citizen who had left the Ottoman Empire unlawfully, then he would have been deported from the empire. So he returned to the empire, essentially masquerading as an Ottoman subject, hiding the fact that he had naturalized as an American citizen. And per American policy at that time, that was unique to Ottoman Armenians. It wasn't a policy applied to anybody else. Because he had done that, he was essentially assumed to have voluntarily forfeited his American citizenship, and so he wasn't helped. So he eventually found his way to Egypt, where he tried to secure permission there for his family to join him. Had trouble there. Eventually was able to reunite with his family, but that was a very, very common type of thing. 10 years, 5-10 years, a very common amount of time for these migrants to spend away from their families, and would have expected to spend that amount of time apart from their families when they set out. That wouldn't have been considered unusual.
Right, I would agree with that. And that's certainly what I've seen in our little case study here of Armenians in Minnesota. And I'm sorry to plug my own book here, but if you want examples of, stories of immigrants who were doing that, this is Armenian American Sketches by Bedros Keljic. These are short stories by one of those migrants about what he saw and who he knew, stories of his fellow migrants, who in many cases did intend to come and work for a few years, send money back, go back home, retire, or, at least live a better life. But what happened in a lot of these cases is, you had a whole population of men on their own in the US, right, and Canada, but, I'm speaking of the US. And then the genocide happens, and that's just an absolute curtain, right? After the genocide, everything is different. You have a whole population of men who are, widowed now or never did get married, whatever. And then you have these women who survived. And so then the big question after the genocide was to how to bring these two people together to basically restart the Armenian people. And that's a whole different story. But the situation you're describing in your question is not at all atypical. It's just what you'd expect. Next.
Got a question here from Umit, and one that I think is a very, very important one. Are records that you use for your book accessible to non-Turkish scholars, or is Turkish citizenship required to access them? I know from a talk that you gave that these studies could be made about other cities, but I wonder what would come about depending on the accessibility of the records.
Yeah, very good question. I always like the questions about the sources and the methodology. I mean, it depends on what kind of sources or materials you're engaging with, actually. So I employed primary Armenian materials, secondary Armenian sources, Armenian memoirs, newspapers, testimonial accounts, interviews, and so forth, and private papers, family records. And I also used local books, local library, especially local libraries based in Gaziantep. I benefited from the books written by particularly the same local elites who wrote about the history of the city. And of course, Armenians were pejoratively portrayed and so forth. But along the lines, you could grip a significant amount of information about the time period. And those records are accessible if you have the ability to use or to have, you have Armenian language skills. So you can go to Armenia, Armenian archives, Novarian Library in Paris, Vienna, Patriarchate archives for newspapers, and Lebanon, Antalya's archives, or the archives in the Haigazian Library as well. I also used some French sources and Ottoman archival materials as well. So I worked perfectly well, comfortably and safely in Prime Minister Ottoman archives. And of course, I wasn't able to reach out certain documents, specific documents, which I was looking for, but nonetheless, I employed and I found and employed numerous cipher telegrams and also numerous documents from different units of Ottoman state, central government at that of the time, and these sources are available regardless of your nationality, ethnicity, race, and so forth. So, but of course, it depends on what kind of sources you are looking for. I constantly and adamantly ask each and over the course of like 14 months about, can I see records of liquidation commissions? Can I see the records of safeguard commissions? So all the time, the answer was no, no. Why? Because they haven't been cataloged yet. They haven't been classified yet, which means they do exist.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So that's it.
Okay. Other questions?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Berkant. I know as our organizer, I'm sure you have questions, and I see your hand raised there. So please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. While imagining this panel, I think at the center, we were thinking primarily like two things. Rather than taking the Armenian Genocide as a single event that depicted in 1915, how can we think of the long durée? And also how, rather than this state-centered understanding of the genocide, what was happening at the local level. And I think both David's and Umit's conversation diverged our understanding a lot in a very detailed way. I was wondering also, how can we take this interplay between because this was our third idea on the how the concepts of dispossession and migration can be thought of as entangled. And I was wondering, how would you reflect on that entanglement between the two? For instance, what would David say about dispossession, and what Umit would say about migration? I know that these don't have to be like perfect scholarly answers, but I was wondering how, during your doctoral dissertation and its aftermath, how did you come up with those ideas, those concepts?
Umit, do you want me to go first, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
All right. And it's a great question, and I see them very much interlinked. When I had originally thought about what I was going to say today, I actually wanted to talk about questions that I was unable to answer in the book. And so my book became about the politics of migration, but it started very early on, now 15 years ago, based off of a series of documents I encountered actually in the US archives that were talking about how this migration was, in a sense, transforming the landholding patterns. It was hinting at that. There was transforming landholding patterns in the Harput region through remittances, through return migration. And some of this was echoed in village histories also, where they talked about how the emergence of large-scale migration to North America shifted the economic advantage in the favor of Armenian communities in the Harput region. And I thought that was really interesting. That was the dissertation, eventually the book that I wanted to write. And I simply didn't have the evidence to write that. I found a different set of sources and a different story to tell. But nonetheless, I talk about those dynamics in the book. The book is still, as I mentioned before, a local history of the Harput region. And I have, which at a different talk I can talk about, also these fabulous documents related to a struggle between a very prominent manufacturing family in the Harput region and a very prominent banking and also migrant smuggling family in the Harput region, that attest to the degree of economic and political power and integration that especially Armenian elites in the Harput region had. And I think that's also something that Umit's book talks about in Eintop and Antep as well. That, you know, there is there is another story beyond this one of persecution and dispossession that also leads to this question of real economic and political struggle that Armenian communities in these regions are active participants in and wield a good deal of economic and political power. And so that's addressed in the book. And I think it also gets to, and I would say, although I think that this work needs to be done, so this isn't the definitive answer, but I think the dynamics that Umit talks about in Antep are also similar in the Harput region, in the sense that there is a great deal of local concern leading up to the Armenian Genocide about the economic and political influence and power that Armenian communities have among the Muslim gentry in this region. And that's a key dynamic to understanding how the genocide unfolds also in that local context of the Harput region. And these kinds of works are so important to really begin to, I think, create a much more firm and complicated and sophisticated understanding of what the dynamics of the Armenian Genocide were. It wasn't just the same event in all parts of the Ottoman East, but rather was very much shaped by these specific local dynamics. And we're just now starting to get a good picture of what those look like.
Wonderfully put, David, thank you. Actually, Berkan's question is quite significant for our field as well, for the relevant field. So these people, they were forced to migrate because of dispossession, land grabbing, taxation, double taxation, and security issues, and so on and so forth. The way in which David eloquently and meticulously, elucidate in his groundbreaking book. And then these people, Armenian people, Ottoman Armenians, citizens, they return after that of the 1908 revolution by making use of the the prohibition of travel ban, the lifting of travel ban, and then another dispossession started. So they got out of this place because of dispossession and other, violent events inflicted upon them. And then with the hope that things were going well, so they decided to return. And then the tremendous dispossession they were subject to, they were exposed to again in 1915, all the way leading up to 1917 and the post-war period and the early 20s. And for instance, these abandoned properties laws, they were valid and used by the Turkish Constitutional Court and other courts, domestic courts, until 1986. You see, dispossession is like, it has been ongoing in aftermath of the 1980 military takeover. So until Özal period, these abandoned properties laws, they were still valid and used by the legal authorities. And migration and dispossession, how it's quite interrelated. I can give you one example from Aintab, for instance. So one such person, Garush Karamanukyan, Luyen, one of the richest Armenians in the city, in Aintab. So he had immigrated to the United States and earned his citizenship prior to deportations. He was the representative of a New York company that exported handkerchiefs to Turkey. Despite his American citizenship, Liquidation Commission in 1916 confiscated his property. The sum of which was then deposited in the Aintab branch of the Ottoman Bank. Subsequently, Karamanukyan appealed to the American consul in Istanbul. Ambassador Morgenthau contacted Talat, asking him to restore Karamanukyan's property, upon which Talat sent a cipher telegram to Aleppo province, ordering an investigation of this issue. Mustafa Abdülhalik Bey, the Governor General of Aleppo then, stated in her response to Talat that Karamanukyan was still an Ottoman national. Just as David has just explained, according to 1869 citizenship, the Article 5th and 6th of Ottoman citizenship, first citizenship law. And according to his telegram, upon hearing the deportation order, Karamanukyan has deposited his assets under the name of his son, who was in the United States. In addition, Abdülhalik Bey claimed that Karamanukyan's US citizenship was not valid. Therefore, he reported that Karamanukyan and his sons were regarded as Ottoman nationals and their abandoned properties were confiscated according to relevant articles of liquidation law.
Wow. Wow.
I want to give an opportunity, Joachim. I saw your hand was also raised if you have a question still.
Yes, but there are still questions in the Q&A, and our visitors are more important than me, so please, they should have their turn.
Very generous of you. All right, let's look to our Q&A. The question here, is there any chance of obtaining a list of returning Armenians to Karput? Sorry.
Harpest.
Thank you.
Or Harput, either way.
Let make him say Mamaratul Aziz.
Yeah, Mamaratul Aziz. Mamaratul
I can
Aziz
barely
being-
say that.
Yeah, well, let's see. We have Harput, we have Harpert, but we can't forget Mesre, all in the province.
Yes,
Exactly.
So, in case we all need a Ottoman geography lesson. So, I don't have a specific name-by-name list, but the Ottoman state in the late 1890s in particular was actually keeping count of the number of returning migrants who were arriving at various port cities. And the records are most complete for Samsun. And that allows me to give an idea of the volume of people who are returning at a given time, especially in the late 1890s. That begins to falter then in the early 20th century. So I do have some specific numbers. Again, it's very incomplete, but in any given month in Samsun in 1898 or 1899, there were about 20 to 30 returnees coming back each month. And these are people who would have left in the late 1880s and early 1890s when the number of Armenians who were migrating to North America was still quite small. Then the U.S. There's a commission, immigration commission that the U.S. inaugurates in 1909, I believe 1908, 1909, that also provides numbers of returning migrants. And what it shows is a pretty steep increase in the rate of return, especially after 1908, the lifting of the migration ban. And so you see the numbers go from the annual numbers go from the high 100s to the low 1000s by 1913, 1914. And again, we're talking about total, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 80,000 Armenian migrants who leave for North America between 1885 and 1915. And so the sort of conservative estimate that I give is that upwards of 1/3 of Armenians who migrate to North America return at some point. That doesn't, of course, distinguish between people who are returning temporarily and those who are returning permanently. I mean, that's a much harder figure to be able to determine. But I also include in the book individual stories like Johannes Topalian, who's on the cover of the book, of people who made that return journey and what their experiences are. I mean, how they're able, especially before 1908, to bypass Ottoman authorities. What routes are they taking to get back to their home communities in the face of this ban on both migration to and return from North America? And there is a person by the name of Mark Aslan who has gone through lives in North Carolina. I mean, he's not a professional historian. He does this as sort of a side gig, but he has compiled a massive list of them. Yeah, I mean, he's devoted his life to compiling a massive list of people who migrated to North America in this period. And I'm trying to remember what his website is called. Maybe Luann Matosian remembers. Luann remembers.
I think it's Armenian Immigration or something, but
something like
look
that,
for
yeah.
Mark Arslan. Just search for him. His website is massive, and it's free of charge. Anybody can access it. You don't even have to register. So it's great. I want to respect people's time here, and there are a couple of burning administrative questions I need to ask for the benefit of people who may have possibly arrived late. One is for those who want to learn more about this subject, where are your books available? That's one, hold that thought. And two, Berkant or Joe, I think you may have mentioned this before, but just to repeat, will this webinar be archived for later access? So both questions. Where are the books available?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Am I on mute? Oh no, sorry, I was talking to myself. I'm putting it in the chat. So it's in Amazon. On Amazon, it's available. It's about if you choose the paperback, please choose the paperback. It's much cheaper. It's about $20. So I'm including the Amazon link and in the chat, and I'll also include the press link in the chat also.
Okay, Umit, where can people buy your book?
I am exactly doing the same.
Okay.
So
Okay, put it in the
following
chat.
the lead. So it's available in Amazon and Harvard University Press website. It's available in bookshop.org, Barnes and Noble, and Ape Books, and all these outlets. It's available.
Great, thank you very much. All right, so will this webinar be archived? Can someone respond to that, please?
Yeah, we'll have this up on the center's YouTube channel in about a week, less than a week. So it will always be there and accessible online.
Perfect. All right, so it's now 1:30. It's been a pleasure to serve as your moderator, but I can be overruled if CHDS wants to continue this conversation. What say you?
Well,
Go
ahead, Joachim.
Yeah, just a brief final word, if I may. Yes, I had questions too, but I think there were too many. And I had one central question, which would probably merit another seminar. And that would be a question, a comparative question. There was so much in what you both said, where I had to think about differences and similarities to the preparation and execution of other genocides. And I'm also thinking about links across genocides, not just comparative analyses. I'm thinking about that infamous statement of someone who said, who still remembers the Armenian Genocide. And I wonder how those actors and criminals benefited from the administrative experiences of the Ottoman Empire. So those would be fascinating questions to discuss, but indeed they would occupy an entire additional seminar. So if I may, I would just like to thank again Joe Eggers, Berkant Chagla, Alejandro Baer from the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I would very much like to thank our book authors, Umit Kurt and David Gutman, who made really important contributions to this literature on the Armenian Genocide. And last but not least, I would like to thank Luen Matosian, who with her intellect and her elegance and her wonderful ways facilitated this event. Thank you very, very much, all of you.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure.
It's an honor.
Yes, thanks so much. Thank you for organizing this. This was really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Much
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.